I do wear a lot of different hats, to be honest. So director of corporate development, and then under that falls a number of sort of established responsibilities. Manage our customer advisory board, being one of them for AEC, media and entertainment, products and e-commerce. But in addition to that, there's always that idea of facilitating a connection and feedback from our customers.
Mm.
So one of the things that's critically important with a software like ours is actually understanding what the needs are of customers. And obviously that's fairly simple to say, but it's hard to do, especially as companies get bigger and bigger. And you'd be surprised in how many customers are kind of clueless to the actual needs, the workflows, the challenges that customers have.
Mm.
So part of what I do is interact with a lot of customers, particularly key accounts and things like that, and package that information in such a way that it can really be digested and assimilated across various aspects of our company, and I use that information also to drive sort of product innovation concepts. So if I start hearing something like, oh, we're really interested in stylistic renders, like Enscape's too realistic. What can we do to, we have to have all these processes where we kind of like detune the graphics to make them more presentable, or they'll show me examples. Like I saw one, I don't know if you've seen those like postcards from Hawaii and from the 50s where it's like a picture of like, Mauna Lea or something like that. And then they have like kind of bougainvillea around it and things like that. They're doing that with Enscape renders, which is really fun to see. And I'm like, wow, this looks great. And they're like, yeah, it's great, but it takes us like, a day and a half. I'm like, so then I'm like, okay, well, maybe there's something we can do, right? So that starts off an idea. I put together like a vaporware video, talk to dev to get a sense of like time, show it to customers to get feedback. And then from there, it might actually roll into a product. So there's that aspect of like trying to like connect the dots across all these different departments.
That's super interesting. Yeah. And to be honest, we're just going to use that part of that you just said in the interview because I think it's fascinating. Real quick, what is a vaporware video?
Oh, maybe that's just something I made up. That's one of the things I'm not really, it's like there's some people who are like really hemmed in by like the job description. It's like, if it's not my job description, I'll do it. Or like they're really into the terminology of their industry. And like for me, I'm more of like functional outcomes. So I just make up terms probably for a lot of things. But vaporware is probably one of those where like I have an idea of something I want to do. Like one of the things we'll be launching this year is the idea of integrating real-time energy analysis into Enscape.
Oh, wow.
And this was something where a lot of people are like, you can't do that. Like it's too complicated. Like it's not possible kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no way, totally can do it. So what I did is I created this idea of like, based off of what I thought was possible, a video showing how someone's going to use Enscape, what the product's actually going to look like, all this kind of stuff. And I showed it to people and people are like, holy cow, how soon can I buy it? I'm like, well, actually, I just made this up.
Okay.
But they really loved it, right? And so what you do with something like that is you get people really excited, and you get enough people excited, all of a sudden it has momentum of its own. And you kind of like, you kind of create your own reality. And so once we did that, I got enough people like totally excited, like when can, let me sign on the dotted line. Then I went out and found a tech partner and got them excited about it and, formed a team, a partnership around this. And now we'll be launching it this year. And believe it or not, it actually looks a lot like that vaporware concept I initially cooked up. That's just one of them, right? There's a lot of other avenues for innovation, but that's one that I do. But also there's other stuff I do. I like do trends reports. So I look at economic trends, business trends, track all the other companies that are out there, and put that into a report that goes out to all employees on a monthly basis. We're closing in on 3 years of those reports. They're actually really great, I have to say. And then manage our strategic partnerships. So obviously we're a plugin to a lot of different software.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously those take good relationships to maintain those, whether they be around development, co-marketing, sales opportunities, that next level innovation. So I'm sort of the point person for a lot of those relationships that we have with the big companies that we integrate with.
Mm-hmm.
Mergers and acquisitions is another place. So vetting companies, speaking with them, actually going through the whole process of potentially acquiring, in some cases acquiring, quite rarely, but things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of different hats that I end up wearing, but all of it's really about ultimately creating a better product, fundamentally speaking.
Yeah, it's a lot of different hats. I do want to ask about that vapor video, is what you called it.
Vaporware, yeah.
Vaporware. I'm so curious about it. So
I'd love to show you some. Maybe one of these days I can.
Is it like it's a mock-up? So what, you take screenshots of the application, you draw on palettes and say that the palette could look like this?
I make whole videos, honestly. So it looks like a real software.
Okay.
So, but some of them aren't. Like, there's one right now where, like, one of the trends that I've been noticing, it's like the metaverse kind of imploded, right?
Right.
Sure.
But at
It
the same
lasted for about
time,
8 months.
it did. It was a great 8 months. But like in the last trends report, like what I do is like a year-end wrap up, and I always like to look back on the trends that I called at the end of 2022 that like totally just failed to come to fruition.
Yeah.
And I was all in on the metaverse. So, take anything I say with a grain of salt, because that one certainly didn't happen.
I
But
think we all were, man. We all
it was a
were.
good idea, right? I mean, I did like an interview with Big and talked to them about the place they did with for Vice Media and stuff like that. I mean, there was a lot of great ideas out there, and I thought it was a lot of fun. Um, but one of the things that is interesting about the metaverse is like it's almost like the word itself has become dirty, but the concept still has merit. If you look at Roblox, like it saw huge growth. I mean, what is that, like 70 million active users or something like that around the world? I mean, it's a lot of people.
Hmm.
And then the other thing that we're seeing is a lot of this like immersive shopping that's happening, like where like Crate and Barrel just launched a store. It's like an online virtual store where you can go in, you can like see things, you can navigate around, you can click on something and get a little bit more metadata on a particular product and buy it, things like that. It's like an alternative to going into brick and mortar. So I'm still seeing some sort of metaverse-like
Sure.
concepts that are out there. So one of the things that we're noticing is like across our product portfolio, there's all these pieces that are actually, if you put them together, would deliver that.
Mm.
So this is something where I showed like, okay, here's how I can kind of go to the corporate parts bin, sort of pick all these different pieces, aggregate them. And so then it's like somewhat of a video, but somewhat of a presentation, but also a little bit of an economic argument and trends argument all fold together to create sort of this concept. And then I show it to our chief product officer who's like, not so sure about this, but hey, I'll keep it on the back burner and dust it off in a little while and see what happens.
It's a really cool way to kind of think of new products and new ideas. I mean, it's sort of it's sort of like you're being a developer or an architect where you're proposing the idea and the project first in a conceptual sense, and then you're just getting people to buy into it. And if people feel like it has validity and value, then it has legs and then it continues.
Exactly. I mean, it's about getting people excited, right? And obviously, both of you are architects. I played architect at an architecture firm for a number of years. I was a
What does
principal at a
that
firm.
mean?
Well, I was a principal at a firm called Kieran Timberlake.
Yeah.
And I was there for 14 years. But I'm not an architect. So I like to say I played architect because obviously, there's a lot that goes into being an architect. So I certainly don't want to put forward the perception that I am one, but I did a lot of I was at an architecture firm involved in design projects for a number of years, and one of the key things I found is that you want to get people engaged, whether they're your own team, whether they're the client group or the stakeholders, all those different entities. If once you get them excited about a project, all of a sudden everything, it's like sort of like it's the facilitator, if you will, sort of like the grease on the hinges, and it makes everything better. So that's a big part of what I always try to think about. It's like, okay, how can I get people engaged? How can I get them excited? And from my perspective, a lot of that's about the right communication methodology.
We are obviously going to talk about real-time renderings, but I am curious to hear more about your time playing architect. For 14 years is a long time.
It's a long time playing architect.
It's probably It's probably
I got pretty good at it by the end. I thought I did.
I mean, that's like a career almost. I mean, it is a career. So, as a principal at an architecture office, when you were not an architect, and also this means that as far as I know, you didn't study architecture either. It wasn't just that you weren't licensed; like you didn't have a background in.
No. I mean, it was funny to go through like the learning curve, right? You show up in the first day and like, you're always overconfident or whatnot, but there's just a whole lexicon that I needed to learn. But then also like some really funny things where it's like you get called out for saying things that, like I remember somehow like I said cement instead of concrete, and it was like, I was like, oh man, like it was terrible. It was like really embarrassing because you want to sound like you're talking about it, and you say things where it's like clearly to those in the business, you don't know what you're talking about. So it was a fun learning curve.
Well, that I feel like that's a relatively minor offense. The one that we hear most often.
I still remember it.
The one that we hear most often from your clients when they're trying to express something, or sometimes they're trying to pretend like they know more than they do, and it's really transparent that they don't, is they will mix the words beam and column. And actually, it creates confusion, because for me, I'm very confused. I'm like, what do you mean the beam? There's no beam here. And then realize that they're talking about a column.
Nice. Oh, that's funny. I don't think I've ever gotten that one, or maybe I just...
You just avoided it.
Because that's one of the things is like, because I came from that background, like I'm always, like I said, I'm very casual about terminology. I'm much more about intent. And I can usually, like, I'll sniff through it, but then like sometimes I'll talk to people where like I'll say something that's not quite right, and they'll be like, "What are you talking about?" And then they'll repeat it back to me, like, "Do you mean this?" Which is like in my mind was exactly the same thing. And I was like, "Yeah, that's what I meant."
And this is a very specific point, but I do think that in a way, the not being hyper-focused on terminology can produce an effective way of communicating to people in general. So what I'm saying is I do find that some folks, when they rely very heavily on vocabulary that's specific to an industry, specific to something else, it can be a way to kind of close off communication. It does close off communication.
It's totally exclusionary.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're trying to assert yourself in some... I mean, I don't think it's always the case, right? There's a lot of places where hyper-specific language is really appropriate. So I'm painting a broad brush here, but I do feel like it's a little bit like the sort of the pre-speak in Latin in like the old church, it was like a way of like sort of retaining power in a sense. And to me, like that's not my intent. I'm always thinking, okay, how can I bring more people under the tent and make it more inclusive? And I feel like language is one of them, but also that's one of the things I really like about, you say, oh, how does this loop into like rendering or visualization? That's what I love about it. What we do is that if I were to show a client like a section drawing, like the number of times I think they saw a drawing where they nodded and pretended to understand, it was a lot. Whereas you put them in a VR headset or you show them a rendered view where they can navigate. It's like, well, they have all the training they need from the day they were born. Like they're starting to understand space from childhood, and I really like that aspect of it because I feel like everyone should be allowed to play architect.
Interesting. I do think that understanding your time at Kieran Timberlake would help us understand sort of what you do now and what you bring to the table in general, because again, I think your roles are fascinating. So how does one practice as a principal at an architecture office when they're not an architect?
Well, you do something else other than drawing sets. That's what you end up doing. So I was there in a research capacity. I interned when I was actually at forestry school. And so when I was getting a graduate degree. And so I went there essentially with the perspective of, I was like, well, I really want to address large scale environmental problems. And one of the biggest environmental problems you have is essentially the built environment, fundamentally speaking. Yeah, it's buildings, right? And actually I noticed on your past podcast, like you went to Monterey Car Week, and that's actually where I'm from. My family's been there for a number of generations, and you've seen it sort of evolve over time, if you will. And one of the things that became really apparent is most environments kind of heal themselves, but man, once you start putting buildings on it, man, you start paving things and, you throw down some concrete, all of a sudden, the environment doesn't heal itself, or maybe it does, but it just takes a lot longer. And so that was sort of the ethos I went into this. Was like, okay, is there a way to actually start to look at the built environment as having a sort of restorative potential, ways in which you can balance these ecological goals with environmental development? And obviously probably that thinking isn't so unusual at this point in time, but at the time it was kind of, it was a little more unconventional.
We're talking about 18 years ago, 17 years ago when you started?
Yeah. This would have been like 2004 or something like that, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So about 18 years ago or so. So when I was at the school there, I basically had an opportunity, between years to get to have an internship. And I wanted to find a firm that sort of wanted to play ball with that type of thinking. And Kieran Timberlake happened to be one of them. They're like, well, we're not really sure what we'll do with you, kind of a thing, but we're interested. And so it ended up being a great opportunity there to do exactly that, to analyze projects and say, okay, where are the opportunities here with this project? It's like, yeah, you're building something. Yes, it's going to have a big environmental impact, but are there ways in which you can either, reduce it or kind of give back in such a way you actually start to use this as a vehicle for sort of ecosystem restoration. But thinking very broadly, right? Like, it's not just like, okay, what is this about infiltration? Some of it's about pedagogy. How do you use these buildings to teach? How do you even use it to move policy? Like, one of the projects we had was actually for the University of California, San Diego, where I went to undergrad. There was a building we were working on there, which is kind of sad. It actually kind of demoed a place where actually right next to where I lived, and I had a lot of friends that actually lived in some of the places that were leveled. But on that project, there was a water reuse component that I really pushed for, and I made I had to go into all the legal code and things like that. And at the time, it was really difficult to use water to reuse water for any use other than subsurface irrigation. And so what we had done is we had been able to, through this project, get like a sort of like a pilot permission to reuse the water for irrigation that could be potentially on the surface, and then also plumb for the toilets and things like that. So they could actually use it for flushing toilets and whatnot. And they're like, well, if this goes, then we can expand it. And it ended up being pretty successful. And I think from there, they were able to modify the policy on a larger scale. But it was like one of these great opportunities where it's like, okay, one project, it's like, yes, you're building something. Yes, there's environmental impact, but it could actually have a pretty significant impact from the perspective of water, which in the state of California isn't just a matter of scarcity. Like, one of the things that we were doing as far as the analysis there is you looked at the energy that was embodied in water in San Diego. And essentially to get it there, like, yes, you had some reservoirs and whatnot, but you also had to like pump, like, portion of the water was pumped over, multiple passes. It was like coming over to Tehachapi, over the Grapevine. And it was being pumped via like diesel fuel generators. I mean, it was this crude, very dirty water, so to speak, from an environmental perspective. And so it was like all of a sudden it wasn't just like, okay, water conservation and the impact therein, but it was also like all these other things, right? Particulate emissions, CO2, so on and so forth.
I would imagine that your time there at that office, or at an architecture office kind of in general, let's say, would have greatly helped you in your position now. And what I'm thinking about maybe more specifically is I've always thought that to be an outsider, someone who's not directly in a certain profession but exists in that practice, in that profession, in an office like you did, would be just very, very interesting for the outsider. Let's call it an outsider, and and also for the people at the office, because I'm sure that you saw things in that office and in the profession of architecture in general that most architects just would not see because we're in it.
Yeah, fish doesn't know it's in water, so to speak.
And you're also still kind of in that same position where a big part of your job is understanding, basically what architects and designers do. What were some of the things that you learned or surprised you about architects?
I mean, one of the biggest differences is it's just not as glamorous, or maybe it is in some areas, but for the overwhelming majority, it's not nearly as glamorous as perhaps say pop culture makes it out to be.
That's interesting.
You'll see like a movie where it's like, that's sort of like the ex-boyfriend that's like a threat comes in, and it's like, oh, he's an architect, that kind of thing. Whereas the reality of it, it's just a lot of work, right? It's like bathroom details. It's like, oh, I'm going to look at like, making sure each one of these doors opens like as the proper width, and is like all this kind of stuff, the accessibility or something like that. Just grinding through, or like specifications. Like, maybe that was like, for me, it got killed really quick because I was doing a project where I had to create some educational material, and I was like, I need to find out this or that. And they're like, oh, you need to go to the project specs. And they basically took me into a back room and gave me 8 filing cabinets full of crap. And you're like, here you go. Let it rip. I was like, welcome to be an architect. It's things like that where I think within my mind going into this, my ignorance initially was that there was sort of this element of glamour. It was like everyone's a star architect because at the grad school is that I took some classes at the architecture school,
Hmm.
audited some, did some joint classes, things like they had a really great auditing program. You could just like sort of show up and like take all these different classes and got scores mostly if you'd attended or not. So I did a lot of that and. Essentially the final feedback you would get was like everyone was being trained to be a star architect.
Yeah.
They're all trained to be the next Geary or something like that. So I went into this internship with this mindset of like, that's what it was being an architect. It was like just big lofty ideas. Whereas it turned out that a lot of it is painstaking detail. And that good buildings live or die by those details. That was the other part that really blew my mind. It's like waterproofing, that kind of thing. It's like, wow, I had no idea that like doing that, the details that you might have on like things like that between like two different materials, between like say your window and the sill, and how that's going to be detailed is like that is what will make that building succeed or not. And I had no idea. So to me, that was a real mind blower. I think the other thing that was interesting too was how passionate the people are at architecture firms. You know, it's not like a lot of industries where it's like it's a job.
Mm.
Right.
Almost everyone I talked to, whether it be at the firm that the architecture firm where I worked, other firms that I interacted with and ended up interacting a lot with a lot of other firms given the nature of my work. But the sheer passion that people have for design. It's like we would go on trips, if you're doing a project in LA. And well, what do you do in LA after all the meetings are done? It's like, well, you grab dinner and then we all hop in the car and we go sightseeing to see like certain buildings, right? And they aren't like the big buildings. It's like Frank Gehry's first house in a residential neighborhood, that kind of thing. And it was like that's what you did. It was like this sheer passion for architectural design that really caught me off guard, and I think makes almost a twofold and maybe
Mm.
outcome. One side is, of course, it gives people the motivation to produce great design. Like everyone really does want to be a great designer, whether they're working on a McMansion, a strip mall, or the type of work that your firm does. They really want to do great design. But on the other side, I think honestly, it's used to take advantage of architects. Because they're that passionate. It's like any other industry. It's like I don't know, like the sports industry. Like you look at
Mm.
I don't know, like bicycling or something like that. And a lot of people are underpaid, frankly, because it's like, oh, you're working in an industry where you get to indulge your passion. Um, and I think so. There's sort of a twofold effect. One quite positive, and I think one quite negative.
It never occurred to me so clearly, but I do think most people would be surprised of how dedicated architects are and how nitty gritty it can be. And even though it's nitty gritty and you're dealing with the nuts and bolts and the not glamorous stuff, like 90% of the time, sometimes the architects are still very passionate about architecture in that sense and architecture as a whole.
Oh
I guess
yeah.
and I also agree that it allows a lot of architects to be taken advantage of. It also allows a lot of younger designers and architects to be taken advantage of by employers who are like, well, you're dedicated, right? So then come work for me as an intern, even though you've been graduated for 10 years. Um,
Yeah.
so talking about your position now and more about the rendering, I know that you guys recently completed a very fascinating report on the use of, specifically the use of real-time rendering and also AI, which is a whole, that's a whole
Yeah.
conversation.
Oh
Um,
yeah. No, that's as you can imagine. I'm basically like chin deep in that right now.
well, let's start
But
with
that was
that
a
then.
great report. I loved that one. It's the marketing team reached out to me and they're like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And I was like, "Oh, this is huge," because I think one of the challenges that I had when I was in industry is like you could talk to a lot of different people and you had events and things like that, but you never got a chance to talk to a couple thousand of your competitors, and
Mhm.
that's essentially what we were able to do with this broad industry survey. We could talk to thousands of firms and kind of figure out where they were and what were some of the key challenges that they were having. And you mentioned a couple of them, like one is like real-time rendering and visualization. And the person that I work with, whose team I'm on, has a term of like referring to things as just being table stakes. And I'd say that's one of the key conclusions, at least I got out of that report, is like, if you're not doing rendering and visualization as a form of communication right now, like that's table stakes for decent design at this point.
What does table stakes mean?
Oh, table stakes is like you can't even you're not even able to gamble. So it's like you go to Las Vegas and you go to the blackjack table, right? Table stakes is like you gotta, it's like sort of like the minimum at the table. And like that's the idea of like that's the minimum threshold to be a competitive firm.
And that's something we talked about in a previous recording, like how, as we come across sometimes, with potential clients and how the architects work, like some of them from maybe a completely different generation are still working only in plans and 2D. And we're like, well, it's 2024 now. Things have changed. Clients, as you put it, don't always understand drawings, and there's tools that are easily available and easy enough to learn to kind of bridge that gap. So there is kind of to us also like a standard minimum, deliverable that should be shown to client and used during the process, also just for ourselves as the tools for design. And 3D is definitely a big one, and renders it just makes sense.
But you're bringing up an interesting question though, when I think about it, because on one side there's the visual communication, right, and then there's the other side, there's the documentation. And I still feel like the 2D stuff is fine for documentation, right? To be able to build it, right, it's totally fine. So it's like, I wonder if some degree we're almost seeing an inefficiency by trying to, obviously our whole software is predicated upon the fact that these two have been combined, so I got to be careful. But the truth be told, it's like, you create like a Revit set, right, or the Revit model, right, and then out of that you create a 2D set that's handed over to the contractor, right, and they're going to use that for their cost estimation and their bidding and then for construction and all that sort of stuff. So it's like, well, then what was the point of the 3D model? And so that's one of the things, like, I always want to respect the fact that within certain industries, they are really good at working off of that 2D set. And so is there some way in which you can kind of have your cake and eat it too? If you're old school and you want to do things in 2D for documentation, hey, knock your socks off. But if you want to communicate to the client, you're going to have to think of a different methodology. And can we get them access to visualization that is intuitive and can easily be shared with all stakeholders, while at the same time, from a documentation perspective, they can stick to their old tried and true. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity there. And part of why I'm thinking that is at Kieran Timberlake, we did a lot of historic renovations, and we got to do a lot with what was my favorite architect, which is Eero Saarinen. And we did a renovation of one of the colleges at Yale that Eero Saarinen had designed, and I think his original drawing set was something like 30 pages. And our renovation was like 3,000, right? And you're like, well, geez, was our design any better? I don't know. So there's something to be said for like this old school, really simple way of communication, but that this was still packed with detail, but maybe also indicated a higher degree of trust and less liability, if you will, when it came to the contractors and things that.
The building code was probably also less stringent.
A little more casual.
Permitting was also probably easier.
You bring up so many interesting points. That last one for sure, just the complexity. First of all, building technology has evolved massively in the last X number of years, thrown out a number. And so as a result, that's also why the construction document sets are heftier. It's also liability. It's just a lot of things.
Building's definitely more complex, and that's what we would always find when we do these renovations. People are like, well, we hired you as a firm that's got top 10 projects. You have this whole research group that says they can deliver the most sustainable building, and yet our energy consumption went up after you renovated it. And it's like, well, that's true, but your original building only had heating. It had terrible lighting.
Right.
It had a minimum number of plugs, so people couldn't even plug in all their stuff.
Yeah.
And now our new building is comfortable. It has heating and cooling, all these things, and it's got technology and whatnot that are wrapped up in it. And yes, your plug loads, everything, your energy is going to go up. So you're right. There's just this inherent level of complexity. Even though people always say, "Oh, buildings haven't advanced," or it's one of the slowest technologically evolving industries, but the truth of the matter is that's not the case by any stretch.
I think it's easy for people to see that from the outside because people think of technology, think of mostly digital tools these days, iPhones, softwares, and things like that. And the pace of that kind of evolution is much faster. But
we're talking about an object versus a building. Like the scale of that is just tremendous.
But they also don't appreciate some of these differences either. Yeah. If you look at, say, a curtain wall from the 80s versus a curtain wall in a modern building, it's a very different and far more sophisticated assembly right now, far more efficient. Like the idea of all these sophisticated low-E coatings that you have on it, the inner layers that you can have, things like that, just the way that they tie back to the building. There's evolution, but a lot of it's hidden. I mean, so much of buildings are hidden.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes back to
people just see what they see.
That goes back to your earlier point, too, of one of your observations about architects or practicing as an architect that surprised you was how much of the work was not glamorous. It's all the stuff that's hidden. I mean, the amount of time that we spend on hidden things to keep water out. Water is like the bane of an architect's existence.
Oh, absolutely.
And a lot of it is that. And it's kind of an interesting thing because, we are spending a lot of time on those details. The client's spending some amount of money on an architect to do those details. And if it all goes well, no one will ever think about it, right?
And the client doesn't realize that's what they're paying for either.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're paying for like a really cool looking building. They have no idea that there's all this other stuff that needs to happen.
Yeah. And then when it doesn't happen correctly, then problems occur.
Oh,
yeah.
And then they know. Then they know.
Then they know.
Yeah.
But so talking about some of the other points,
the report.
Some of the points you brought up, like the report and the visualization, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think the 3D models are useful in construction documents as a way to provide another view to quickly understand complex things, but they don't replace orthographic projections like plans, sections, wall sections, plan details, and things like that.
But they have in some markets. That's what's interesting for us as a global company. We like our customer advisory board has a firm that has offices around the world, and one of them's in Singapore. And that office, then they do some really high-end interiors, big tech companies, things like that, just fantastic designs. And in their offices in Asia, they use SketchUp all the way through.
Wow.
They're from pitching the project through to construction and post-occupancy. They're using SketchUp. The contractor is getting into the SketchUp mode. They're never even producing a drawing set.
But the drawings themselves
seems just happy with it.
But the drawings themselves are 2D views, right? Or they always
they'll just
3D?
It's all in the model.
Oh, yeah. It all comes from a model.
And then from that, they may take out some 2D. But from my understanding, actually, the contractor will take the actual SketchUp model, and we'll work with that. And I think part of it is just the nature of the construction crews that they have in some of these regions. They might just be labor that's kind of highly seasonal and things like that, and they may not necessarily know all of the shorthand and the details and things like that, but they can understand these 3D models.
Oh, so you're saying that there is actually not even really a construction document drawing set. It's just a physical computer model that they have probably on a computer, an iPad on site, and they're pulling dimensions off of there.
I mean, isn't that wild?
It's an interesting thing because I think that is sort of I don't know if it's going to happen kind of globally. I mean, we'll see, who knows, but that's always been sort of the next logical step of building information modeling, BIM modeling, right? Is you put everything into a model.
Why go backwards?
Then why go backward to produce drawings from that thing if you have it already? It's just, this gets into, I think that sounds really cool. I think it gets really hard because the amount of detail the architect would have to put into that model would be so great. I mean, that's why also
but
a lot of
architects... That gets back to the Saarinen example, though, right? How much do you trust the contractor? And True. I think that's the interesting position is perhaps that's a situation where they're like, well, the contractor more or less knows what they're doing. I'm not going to tell them how to do their thing.
Hmm.
I just got to put in enough that they kind of get the idea. Whereas now in the US, at least, right, you want to do every little last bit because if something goes wrong, fingers are going to get pointed, and that drawing set is going to be key to making sure that you're not the one holding the blame when it comes down.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. The way we describe it a lot of times for folks who are new to the process is that construction drawing set, document set, is obviously used for all the reasons you mentioned, but it's also when during construction, if there's confusion about something, all of us turn our heads and look to that drawing set and to see if it's there. And if it's there, then it gives us the answer. If it's not there, then it's missing. We need to provide a sketch or clarification or something. But it does really go back to the trust in the contractor, because if you trust, then that's also the power of design build. But let's say you're just doing a typical architect, contractor, client, way of doing a project where they're all separate. There's no way. This sounds not right. There's no way to hold the contractor accountable, or there's no way to know what should have happened unless you have documentation.
Even if you do got great documentation, I mean, I don't know how the scale of projects you've worked on, but I've worked on some where I swear the contractor's primary skill set is finding flaws in the documentation set that they can use to basically get more fee, right? They kind of lowball the bid, and then they make it up by finding something that submitting all these RFIs and whatnot, and then saying, "Hey, we need more money."
Yeah, well, that's one reason why people should avoid low bids in general.
Yeah, well,
usually, if there's a contractor who's way lower,
there's a reason.
There's a problem. There's a problem there, and you're going to get charged later on. But so talking about how the offices that you guys surveyed, which I believe it was around 2,000 practices, and they were all architecture offices. Is that right? Or
that's my understanding. I think there were some interior design firms
right.
in there as well.
Okay. It was interesting to see the report because it breaks down not the number, but the percentage of that 2,000 of the offices who use real-time rendering and in what capacity, how often, in what phases, how large the offices are, and all these different factors. So maybe if you could just talk about some of the insights that you guys gained from this report, and if there's anything that kind of surprised you.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a tough time trotting out any hard numbers from that. I think one of the things for us, as it showed us, were some of the white spaces being a big one. We're not seeing real-time rendering as present in later phases of design, and that's something we knew, but it was certainly reinforced by that report. It's like it has sort of this ramp up, right? A little bit of a bell curve, and it starts maybe a little thicker during pursuit phase. And honestly, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Right? I think that people should be using real-time rendering a lot more when they're going after projects. I think it's a pretty significant competitive advantage. I know a lot of firms like the idea of not presenting designs or anything like that, keeping things very gauzy. But honestly, my experience, a lot of customers or potential customers push back on that, or customers, I should say, clients push back on that. But the big thing for me and the takeaway there was that real-time rendering simply was not really used from like late DD on. And I think there's a huge missed opportunity there because, like I was saying before, it's about communication. And as you get in these later phases of design, having good communication is absolutely key. Whether it's trying to communicate with the contractor or the subs to make sure that they understand what something actually is going to look like. Whether it's say, okay, we have this great clash report. Well, let's just get into Enscape and identify those clashes in an environment that we can all understand, right? It's sort of this nice intuitive environment. We can see where they are. So we see some firms that are using it in those types of capacities, but it's not ubiquitous. And so it told us that there was a really big opportunity there. And we'll be bringing out some features that specifically tailor that. Like one of the things people have been asking us for ages. And every time I showed people an initial concept, they're like, yes, when can I get it? Which was be able to show a render where you're not just showing the material data, but you're also showing Revit filter data. It sounds really basic, But it's something for a lot of people when they try to communicate, say, across disciplines. Some people think traditional materials like, oh, it's a copper pipe, I want to see it in copper. Whereas, maybe your MEP is saying, oh, that's my supply. I'm expecting that to be red, that sort of thing. And being able to toggle back and forth, show both simultaneously, that sort of thing, is one of those where we feel I can get into that white space pretty significantly. So that was, I think, for us, is show that there's a pretty big opportunity when we think a little bit later in the design process. And I think from our perspective, it's a combination of features and communication. Like a lot of people very intuitively understand. It's like, well, I want to be able to show someone, if you're in a design crit, what this is going to look like, but they don't necessarily think about it as a go-to tool for resolving issues during a coordination meeting later in design. So from our perspective, there's a great opportunity there. The other thing that we think is there's a really good opportunity to start to bring rendering into the field. As we were talking earlier, right? It's all about the 2D drawing set, but what we have seen a lot of our customers, not a lot, but maybe some of the really high-end firms are starting to do, is they'll actually put a little QR code on the drawing set where that a contractor in that space can scan it and then actually see what the room is supposed to look like from a rendered perspective. And it's an interesting way of actually aligning the expectation and reality. Which right now it's like, how's it? I'm always surprised that more things don't go wrong. And so how can we, and so that's part of from that report, like, okay, how can we push it, right? And I say, okay, maybe it's about communication. Maybe it's about showing people, people don't know what they don't think about. So can we show some of these use cases? But I think also it's about these very targeted features that can add value later in design around visual communication.
So I want to unpack those 2 points because I think they're interesting, starting with the last one. So I think in your example, to help folks visualize if they're not quite grasping it, is that let's say we're in construction phase for a space. I don't know, it's a great room, whatever kind of space people can get their minds around. And typically the contractor and the subs are building off of black and white 2D drawings that are very technical looking, which presumably all of them are trained to read, and obviously architects are trained to read and produce. Still, though, I think in what you're describing, there can very easily be a gap in communication. Let's call it communication, because that information, those drawings are very, very abstract, and it's very easy to not read something correctly or to misinterpret something, and therefore things get built in incorrectly. Versus if you had let's say the QR code example, a rendering or a static rendering or I don't know what you call it, kind of like a video.
I would call it like panoramas,
exactly,
or immersive panos and that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Of the space that was rendered with materials, it would kind of close the gap of communication between the abstract stuff, which is conveying, all the technical information like dimensions and reveals and et cetera, and the final picture. So when people are constructing it, there's less chances of there being a misinterpretation and a mess up.
Yes, right. It's expectation versus reality. And you want to just closing that gap. I mean, it's an interesting situation because you think of it like you go to a fast food restaurant. I mean, I haven't been one in a while, but I know how it works, right? You got the little picture of the burger and you order it and then you get it and it's like, oh, that was depressing. Not what I expected.
Sure.
Right. So that's a risk. And I think from some people we talk to, they're like, we'd rather not show something because maybe that's not what they're going to get. But then, on the flip side, there's also this thing of like, well, I'm thinking of also like if you order at a fancy restaurant, you got the description and then they cook it and it comes out and it may look completely different than what you thought it was going to look like. But maybe if you guys had a shared expectation, they could have assembled the salmon and the asparagus and so on and so forth in such a way that it actually looked like you expected. How much does that matter? Like, I think in some cases it can matter quite a bit. In other cases, though, I think it probably with some clients, they're like, well, as long as it falls within this sort of range of expectations, it's perfectly fine. I think the bigger challenge might be, though, as you start to bring in more and more sort of subcontractors onto a project. Maybe that contractor's great at the primary contractor's great at reading the 2D drawing set, but they might be bringing in some other folks the drywall folks and things like that. It all sounds fairly prosaic, or maybe they're not as
Sure.
well versed, right? And so I think that there's some other components there where maybe having that aligned perception and reality could be a benefit, particularly as you go to people that don't have necessarily the same level of training and experience.
Yeah, and I do also want to clarify, if I understand correctly, that there's kind of two separate points to be made and two different phases in a project. Let's say the first half of a project, which is, let's say, more the design phases, then the subject really is how the architect is communicating with the client, versus in the back half during CDs and construction, then it becomes a question of how does the architect work with the contractor.
Yeah, right. It's those coordination workflows.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the QR code thing that you mentioned is really about that, call it the back half, right? Versus one of the other points you made was, I think, with the In-N-Out, or rather the not In-N-Out, McDonald's, the fast food.
Yeah.
In-N-Out's clearly on my mind. The fast food and fine dining restaurant is more like the design phase where the architect's interfacing with the client and the client's expectations.
It really is, right? Yeah, maintaining those expectations, I think, is absolutely critical. But you want to maintain a fidelity all the way through. And I think one of the components I've realized working on projects is that you end up with a lot of these unfortunate substitutions on site.
Sure.
It's like, well, I'm sorry, but they were all out of, I don't know, like Glenmore sandstone or whatever the heck it was. Mm-hmm. And so we picked this one instead because it kind of looked close, and the client's like, what the hell is this? Like, it's orange. Like, that's not what I expected. Right. So there's also this need to communicate visually, I think, throughout. And I think it can really expedite things too. How many times have you shown a client two little samples and you're like, well, what do you think? Which one do you like? And I'm like, well, geez, I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at 3 square inches or something. Like, couldn't tell you. And I think there's some great opportunities there where it's like, okay, maybe you're doing something very late, something's getting swapped, give them 2 immersive views, send it to them. It's like, hey, which one do you like? A versus B. And like, B, like, done, and then it gets turned around in a day. I'm just thinking of all this hemming and hawing. Time is money, particularly in a service-oriented industry. And I think that it's not always people's first inclination to think visual communication, which is kind of ironic because that's so much of that is in the early phase of design, but late in phase in design, when it comes to resolving issues, that's not people's first instinct. And I think it could be.
I agree with that. If you have a good contractor, then a lot of these are resolved. But I think my guess is that it's a lot of times contractors feel the pressure of schedule and time, and they just want. And so I think for a lot of folks, so in your example of, like, let's say these 2 colors or 2 materials or whatever, clearly the thing to do would be a large mock-up of whatever potential thing you're going to use. But I think a lot of contractors they don't necessarily push for that because that's going to take time. Because then you got to get
money.
the thing.
Mock-ups aren't cheap.
You got to do a mock-up. The people have to come on site.
Yeah, and I mean, like, let's say you're talking about, like a kitchen tile. You're not going to ask them to do a mock-up for a kitchen tile, but sometimes the client cannot even project using a tile on a backsplash, right? Yeah. Versus you just drop the tile in the 3D, click render, and show them what it looks like. Bingo, in 2 seconds. They're like, yeah, that's the one versus that's not the one.
That's what I want. Yeah, easy.
Which is interesting because I was looking at the pie charts in your guys' report, and it seems like a lot of, let's say, the smaller size firm do not use real-time render as much as the biggest one.
I know, right? And you'd think that they'd be the ones that have the biggest advantage.
Yeah, because you don't want to have a full-time, render guy or lady on payroll in your office to just work on renders. Like, the advantage of real-time render is that you and I could just take care of it, right? It doesn't have to be a designated person doing that outsourced 8 hours every day or outsourcing it, which it's interesting to me. And I'm wondering, well, why is that? Is it because a
lot of them aren't even, I mean, I guess I would probably have to look through the micro data to cross-reference this, but we need to remember a lot of people aren't doing 3D.
I was going to say, is that because of the software that,
not even doing 3D altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're deep in CAD. You look at like residential construction.
Yeah, it's true.
Most people are not, they're doing CAD. So I think that's a big part of it.
I think sometimes we forget that fact because obviously in our backgrounds, Well, no, that's not true. The majority of the time, of all the offices I've worked for, there's heavy 3D. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that you wouldn't use a 3D program, even if it's, Rhinoceros or SketchUp just for concept design. But there are, as you said, a lot of practices, especially in the single-family residential space, is just straight 2D. I mean,
Oh yeah. I mean, it's really easy to get a skewed perception of any industry, but architecture for sure it was one of those. And maybe you ask like things these biases that I maintained for a really long time was at the firm I worked. I thought every firm was more or less like Kieran Timberlake.
right.
And I was like, well, of course you're in Revit. Of course you're going for like a Rhino to Revit workflow.
Yeah.
Of course you have a whole team of people that are dedicated to making mock-ups and full scale and things like that. And then you talk to other firms and you're like, oh, it turns out that the average firm is like what 1.5 people or something like that in the US. They're doing tiny projects and but part of what that does tell me though is like, okay, well, as I was saying earlier, how can we bring more people into the tent? And one of the things that I track is economic data. And I look at the Architectural Billing Index from the AIA. And one of the things that came out in the latest report, or maybe it was their quarterly webinar, I'm not sure which one, but they were looking at backlogs for different firms by size. And large firms are doing fine. They had about 9 months of backlog. These were big firms. They were billing multiple millions on an annual basis. But you looked at smaller firms, those that are billing a couple 100,000, and they were down to 3 months of backlog.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a tenuous position. And so I always like to think, well, what can we do to help? And what can we do to help? And I think it gets to your point. It's like, well, boy, win more work. What can we do to bring them visualization? And then that brings the questions like, well, I'm sorry, but we're in 2D. And I don't always want my answer to be, well, then,
sorry,
get your ass over into SketchUp. Yeah. It should instead be something else, right? It should be like, okay, well, we have a solution for you. And that's one of the things actually I'm really happy to see with AI is that it offers the potential to be a solution for those that are below what we consider sort of normal firms. I mean, from our experience.
I'm very interested to learn what you think how do you think AI could be incorporated into, like, let's say the softwares and the plugins and all the things that we use in our industry.
Well, let me jump in here. I guess one of the specific questions I wrote down, so I want to stick it in when I can, is AI is very heavily used to produce an image from scratch. But and we're not up to date with a lot of it, to be frank. But are there tools now or in the future where AI will be used to enhance an existing design through rendering? Like, do you know what I mean? Like the kind of different things.
That's a total softball question because that's our whole shtick. I like it.
Good, perfect.
But yeah, so our chief product officer has a saying that he said that people seems to resonate with the audience, which is essentially that we don't want to replace the artist. We want to give them a better brush. Obviously, there's a degree of self-interest in there because we have a really good tool set for the artist. And so we want to help them use that tool set more easily, faster, things like that. So that really is our big push. But at the same time, you need to be mindful of the fact that, as I said in our latest trends report, is basically, are these things close enough, essentially, is what you're getting with some of these automatic push button renders, is close enough, good enough? And I suspect for a portion of the market, the answer will be yes. It will be. So to take the first question about, sort of our perspective on how can we give the artist a better brush, 100% that's the case. And at Autodesk University, we presented publicly the first concepts that we have that are in development. In addition to that, we launched our website. If you go to chaos.com/next, you'll see some of these nascent ideas. Some of them are actually quite developed at this point. It'll be rolling out in H1. Some of them will be rolling out in H2 and some thereafter. But the idea is exactly that. We want to give the artist a better brush. So there's a couple of different ways that we conceive of doing that. One is to take the output from a render and modify in some way to achieve a particular outcome. So In the earlier part of our conversation, I was talking about this idea that more and more people want something that's stylistic. They don't want hyper real. And so we feel like AI is a great mechanism for doing that. So we're going to be rolling out essentially a tool that allows for an artistic rendering mode, which is pretty wild in the sense that it's not just here's your image, boom, made artistic. It's rather in real time, you can navigate your building as if it were an oil painting. Which is kind of wild when you think about it, right?
Yeah, there's a big gap between a static image flipping to different versus real time. Yeah.
Big gap, right? And that's something where it's like your mind can't even quite imagine what that would look like in some ways. So from our perspective, that's a big one, right? And that's taking something that you have and essentially supplanting a workflow that people are engaging in now, but also taking it to a next level that frankly you just couldn't do independently through some type of post-processing.
So it's interesting. So why would architects and designers be looking to kind of like present rendering in a different style than a photorealistic one? Is it maybe to enhance the design and the architecture and the things that they're trying to create and propose? Like, like each movies has their own photographic style and genre. Is it to kind of like tailor it that way? Is it to keep it more loose from the client's mind, so it's not exactly the way it's going to look, it's more suggestive?
So both points you bring up are interesting ones. The first one I think is more nuanced and can be executed via our technology right now. But if you talk to like a firm, say like Herzog and Muron, they have a number of visual artists and each one has their own style.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, you want something that's like a little more gauzy, you go to this guy. If you want something that's a little more sharp and refined, you go to this young lady. So there's different so that's at a really high end, right? That's like almost a degree which AI can't compete. The real reason that a lot of people tell us they want this is that, exactly as you were saying, that clients get over fixated on certain details because of that high quality render. It's like whenever you see a data set and it's got everything to like, I don't know, like the thousandth place or something, like, ooh, that's some very accurate information. When it turns out it was just an artifact of like rounding uneven numbers or something like that. And so that's what they want to do, is they want to essentially detune the information to get the client to focus on one thing. So I'm sure in the context of your design practice, you'll go into design review and be like, listen, I need to have 3 questions answered by my client today.
Right.
And
they get distracted.
You go in. Yeah, they get distracted. Next thing you know, like a beagle chasing a rabbit, all of a sudden they're off in left field and you're like, oh my gosh, my 3 questions aren't getting answered and they just brought up 8 more. This is not the way it was supposed to work. So the idea is exactly that, is that you use this detuning of the visualization to essentially focus attention on certain questions. Maybe it's like, well, do you like the overall setting for this house? Do you like the way it's oriented? Maybe it's like, do you like the sense of flow between the rooms, things like that. Whereas getting them fixated on like the carpet pattern or something like that would completely derail the conversation. So I think that's why clients are asking for that. And I think the other side of it too is perhaps just a little bit about visual engagement. And one of the harshest criticisms I've heard of some of our software, like our Enscape software, is that our renders look like those of our competitors. You're like, oh, it's terrible.
Well,
interesting.
I mean, that's a good point. Like, if you look at once projects are completed by architecture firms, you hire a professional photographer, you're going to select the one that you think is the style that represents your firm, the aesthetics, like everything, right? But when you do your renders, if they look like everybody else's render, it's hard maybe for a client to understand like who did the work, why is this firm more sensible to this type of design than another one, right? It's what sets you apart in a way. So
for sure, right? And then they see the same entourage and are like, hey, I just saw that person in someone else's interview deck, and all of a sudden everything just falls apart. So much of this is like building a wedding cake, and getting people excited, and so I think there's that aspect too of like, okay, we need to make this our own. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at, and a lot of people have asked us, is like, hey, can we upload our own training set for that type of artistic render, right? We kind of know what we want. Can we give, say, past renders to do exactly what you were saying earlier, of give a particular style that is sort of it's our firm style on this render, and we can do that more automatically as opposed to the post-processing of an image, taking a JPEG into Photoshop and doing our thing.
Which is interesting because it seems like the appeal of the real-time render is having to have to do less customization in the settings to get it rendered, right? But by talking about those types of style and maybe even like create your own style, then we kind of like go back to customizing things again. So I'm assuming
maybe once.
Or maybe once. Yeah, maybe
right.
once.
But also, people, just because it's real time doesn't necessarily mean that people are really always using it in this true real time. There's some firms, and a lot of firms, where they do use it true real time. You have Rhino open on one screen and you got your Enscape screen on the other, and you're seeing this in real time, and they're taking advantage of that real time. But other firms are taking advantage of the real time so they can just do more iterations. And some people are taking advantage of the fact that by virtue of real time, as you were saying, it's simpler. And so they're just able to produce visualizations more simply without having a viz expert. So they're not really using it real time, but they're as an artifact of real time that has that simplicity that they like. So we have to be mindful of the fact that just because it's real time doesn't mean that's always like the primary advantage for a lot of our users. They like other aspects. Ease of use. Like, you ask people what they like about Enscape. Number one thing, they're like, oh, it's easy to use.
Yep.
That's like the number one thing. It's not real time. It's ease of use, which is interesting. I think if we lost the real time, they would probably
still use it.
That would be it. Yeah, they'd probably still use it, but they would know what they're not getting. But that ease of use, that's number one.
I would agree. That would be our answer on a poll as well.
Like back in the day, we used to play around with, V-Ray and all of those fun settings. And if you're not an expert and you don't know exactly like what data to put in, you have to like watch a bunch of YouTube videos to figure it out. Then your time is just disappearing in a click. And
it goes back to how quickly technology changes too. I'm just thinking like in school, there was a few other programs that were always used, and I can't remember the names of them. But every time there was a new program, it was like the new hot thing, and it's supposed to be so much easier. And then you dive into it and you're like, this is not any easier. And by the way, back then there weren't really YouTube videos on how to use this stuff. So you're like reading manuals, which sounds very archaic now.
Well, that's the other thing with launching new features is how do you make sure that they are actually being used and implemented by your current users, right? You don't want them to have to relearn the software or like have to get trained again.
Oh no, you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you do need to have your software evolve, but you also need to recognize that you have different users that have different requirements. Media and entertainment, if we gave them a simplified software, even if it was just as good, I don't think they would like it. It's like they like all the buttons. It's almost like a point of pride to have that complexity and the fact that they know how to do it. Maybe that'll change in the future, but I don't think they would ever go for a simplified version. So for them, V-Ray and all its complexity, fantastic. They want that. So we do need to be mindful of these different customers. And one of the things that a customer told me that I thought was a really sweet idea, which was, could you capture all of the settings for V-Ray or something like that that are used by a particular artist or a particular firm? So you can get like, you want to have something done in the style of Big. We would like, hey, Big, can you give us kind of like your settings package for V-Ray? We could like capture that. And then you could do your render in V-Ray, sort of using automatically all the various settings that are typically used by a given firm. Which brings to mind the second point on what you were talking about as far as what we see with AI, which is essentially allowing people to use our software better, faster. So something like V-Ray is incredibly complex, but one of the things we're looking at is things like a lighting optimizer or something that can age materials and things like that, which someone could do via all of the settings within our software, accessing, say, the various material libraries, adjusting them, things like that. But it takes a lot of time. And the idea is, well, can we use AI to kind of cut right to it? Right. And so what it's essentially doing is it's not creating this fait accompli. I got to be careful with someone French. I'm probably butchering that one. But
fait accompli, no, you got it.
Oh, thank you. All right, good. But what you end up with some of these softwares that are creating these great images, something out of like Dolly or Midjourney, is that it's done, right? If you want to change it, you got to take it into Photoshop.
Right.
But what we really want to be able to do is say, okay, you can create this great image, but you could create it in V-Ray. And now if you want to adjust anything, you're still using V-Ray. So what it's doing essentially is it's twiddling the knobs, clicking the buttons, and things like that for you, helping accelerate that workflow, but giving you the opportunity to walk it forward, walk it back, that kind of thing. And same thing with like asset placement. For whether it be a large building, you want to be able to say distribute desks for X number of people, or you're doing a school or a gym or what have you, or a cafeteria. Putting all those assets in is a real hassle.
Yeah.
Well, can we have something where it just places the assets, then you can pick every asset and you can delete certain categories of assets if you want, and things like that. But what it's doing is it's accelerating that workflow using all of the capabilities embedded in the software itself. And that's our biggest push, is on that front, where it's essentially allowing you to use our software faster.
Is that capability a feature going to be part of Enscape as well? Is the first question. And then the other question is, how is it a text to image kind of workflow, or how does that? Is there a database?
A lot of what we're doing is focusing on that. It's like text inputs, text prompts is where we're at right now. We may explore other things, maybe like illustrative examples or something like that from a visual reference can be uploaded, and then that can be taken. But so far, everything that we've explored, whether it be, say, like automatic PBR material generation and things like that, have all been text-based. And it seems to be a good methodology so far. It's one that's fairly universal. People are familiar with it.
Yeah.
But I think that we'll probably want to expand that and bring more nuance in the future. But the nice thing, like I said, is that it's not a done deal. You put in a text prompt, but you can adjust it either with another text prompt, or you can adjust it in the software itself. From my perspective, it's kind of like the best of both worlds.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to deep dive into tweaking something because you want to finesse this particular item or material, you can do so and not have to jump to a different program or export or do it kind of weird stuff. It's native.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the part that I find to be most limiting about a lot of these visualization softwares that are out there. Is like once you create something, it's like, well, the only opportunity you have for iteration essentially is another prompt. And that's not enough.
Yeah.
But it's easy.
Is there a timeline for these features?
Like I said, some of them are coming out in H1. I can't quite remember. We had them in that deck I presented at Autodesk University. I know for sure the two earliest ones that'll be coming out will be PBR material generation via text prompt, which I don't know if there's a video that we have for it. I don't know if it's on our Chaos Next site yet, but it's wild. It's really pretty awesome. And then the other one is this stylistic render. That will be an Enscape. That will be an Enscape only feature. But those two will probably be H1. Those would be our earliest ones, and they'll be rolling out other ones throughout the year. Probably the the asset placement is one that like it works great sometimes, and then like sometimes it just falls flat on its face. So
it's okay.
Sometimes you have tables on the ceiling, so that doesn't
it's not quite that bad, but it's like you'll end up with something that looks like there was like a flood and everything got shoved to a corner or something like that.
Well, a few quick things. So the text, using text to modify the image, that was for V-Ray, but is that also going to be something for Enscape at some point?
There might be, but I think obviously Enscape doesn't need PBR materials, so that one's looking at Enscape at this point. But there may be sort of a text to material search kind of a capability and things like that. However, there is a I gotta always be careful with these things. I don't want to let any cats out of the bag. But let's just say there'll be something that's more in the vein of Enscape that can leverage that capability, and that'll be coming out this year,
Gotcha.
and that'll be in there.
And then what does PBR mean?
Oh, physically based rendering. So it's like the materials you'll use for this higher quality rendering.
I
So
see.
you'll actually have, I don't know, like the actual reflectivity and capabilities and things like that. And then you can use those in V-Ray with, like basically the types of global illumination that you'll have in V-Ray. They'll be actually look like real materials.
Right. Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Whereas
Just
Enscape looks pretty good, but it's not like, like you look at leather or something, it doesn't really look like leather when you get
Sure.
up close. Whereas V-Ray, it looks like leather.
yeah.
It's
yeah.
crazy because sometimes you see images and I'm like, I don't know if this is real or not. Like the technology has gone so good that you can't tell.
In our global all hands, sometimes we'll have these like, is it real or not kind of things, and it'll be like
Really?
an interior of like a Gulfstream jet or something like that, and it'll be one that's done with V-Ray, and then one that was done in a photograph, and like, nah, you can't tell which one's which. People, it's like people get it wrong all the time. But what's really cool with actually how they're doing it, I think it's Gulfstream. It's one of those, or maybe it's Dassault or something like that. But what they were doing is they're actually building up basically their own on-site server farm so they could use V-Ray in real time. So they can create these like, it was crazy, right? So you could do these like hyper real immersive 3D renderings using V-Ray for clients, so you're paying all this money for this jet and you're like, well, I want to see like, soft calf skin or something, I don't know, on my plane's interior or something, right? And they're like, yeah, sure, here you go. And here, put on some VR goggle kind of thing and check it out. And I was like,
how much did it cost to set up that server farm?
That's the thing is crazy, right? I was like, man, that's like, I don't even know. I mean, that's probably, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, probably. Easy.
That also points to the difference in the fees and funds that architects have compared to people who are selling private jets.
You can do that bathroom remodel.
Much bigger fees.
Yeah.
No, but it's fun talking to customers. Like we have other ones that are like they're running Enscape on a system that had like a dedicated 240 line to their graphics card. Yeah, they're like, we're really pushing Enscape pretty hard.
I would say so.
Physically speaking.
It's a large retailer, and they were doing all of their distribution hubs and things like that. They were modeling them in Enscape. I was like, wow, man, we need to come up with something better than that. Have you tried our Vantage software?
That's pretty funny. So, no. Yeah, we're using Enscape pretty hard. It's going to start walking now with the machine.
I know, seriously. I was like, man, that's like more than my dryer downstairs. It's intense.
I did want to ask a question about the stylization of renderings, or renderings that are more stylized, which I think is just really, really interesting. And I would agree, and I can see where a lot of architects that we speak with on here and off air, so to speak, that is their biggest fear, of showing something that's too finalized and causes, as you put it, clients to kind of go down the wrong rabbit hole. But so in that, with that feature, it sounds like there would be defaults that one could choose from, and there would also be a way for us to upload something, and then the software learns the style based on what we've uploaded, and it creates a new style, call it palette, based off of what we've submitted. Is that sort of what it is?
Well, this gets a little bit to my like manifest your reality stance.
Okay.
So what you get right now is a series of like pre-baked, this is what you get.
Yeah, sure.
I've been talking to a lot of people who are like, I really want to be able to have my own style. Can we train it? And so that's what I've been pushing for.
Gotcha.
And so I've been showing that some concepts around that to enough people that pretty soon we won't have a choice but to do something along those lines.
It's interesting.
I also like the idea of having basically being able to download like preset packages of those types of setting from architecture firms or even like photographers or artists.
Yeah, would that be neat, right?
That could be really cool because first of all, I think it would give you a library of style much broader than maybe like, the 5-10 basic ones. And potentially maybe down the line, you could just kind of like modify them slightly to just kind of make your own, but that's your starting base as the style.
And I also like it. It's a monetization opportunity. There's
for them,
there's a lot. Yeah, there's like a lot of skill, knowledge, and that whatnot that's wrapped up in that. And these people aren't able to monetize on it. So all of a sudden, we can provide them access to scale.
Yeah.
that I think would be really compelling. So that's the other thing. I'm always like, okay, how can I make this a win-win? And like something like that to me offers a really unique win-win opportunity for people that may not necessarily get that type of chance to actually monetize.
And it also having the presets, the defaults, or those other ones that you could, I guess, purchase that are created by another office or designer or whoever. It is a way to what's the phrase? Lower kind of the entry point. So it's making it easier for the smaller practices who don't have the time to create their own custom ones, custom settings, to just select and just go. Because I can guarantee that for most people,
entry level,
exactly.
Right.
And for most folks, they would look at me like, this is light years better than what I was doing before, and it's way more and beyond good enough. So this is great. I'm going to go with the default. And then if later on, when the firm grows in size, they have the time, the money, et cetera, invest in creating their own style, let's call it. But I think for a lot of
and
folks,
why not create that type of accessibility? I mean, that's the thing that I always, it bothers me is people are like, oh, we got to hold on to this expertise kind of a thing. I'm always like, nah, get it out there. Let everyone enjoy the benefits, because I don't see any downside in something like that. It's not like someone that's designing a house, like it's not like Big is going to be losing money because the architect on this one was able to use their render style, right? It's like those are two completely different markets. So I feel like, it's sort of like a zero loss, all gain type situation with something like that. I mean, which I think is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. And this part of the conversation also makes me think that it's a strange thing with the profession of architecture, because every office spends so much time sorting out figuring out either their style of rendering, as a specific example, the way they do construction details, and all of these, call it quasi-proprietary ways of practicing or ways of doing buildings, ways of doing presentations. And I say quasi because they are proprietary in the sense that they have spent, through the employees' time doing it. But also, to be honest, I can guarantee that 90% of those proprietary details and whatever else, 90% of it's probably the same from one office to the next. So in other words, what I'm saying is I think there's a lot of base knowledge that a lot of architecture practices are producing internally from scratch, when if they had just been able to, call it collaborate in a sense, with another architecture office, or purchase their style or whatever it might be, that would get them past the 90% mark, and then they can tweak the rest if they want to.
But it goes back to efficiency.
Efficiency
and we were talking about it the other day. We're like, it's kind of silly that there is not a place, a website, a library, a book that just has like all of the basic building details in like 2 different climate zones. Yeah. We don't each have to reinvent the wheel. Like, we're not, starting to build buildings. We've been doing that for years, and every office is figuring it out, like you were saying. Yeah. But there is no common place where you could just go to get, that basic stuff. Like, you have to create it.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I've always been astounded on how protective people are, for instance, of like the Revit template files.
Yeah.
Yep.
That kind of thing. It's like, come on, everyone's got one of these. Like, it's not that special. Yet somehow it's treated that way. Yeah. And it's the darndest thing to me. I think you bring up an excellent point. And part of that also is the fact, though, that every building is just a little bit different.
No, true.
And so when you think about like a repository of like, say, like all of these, particular architectural detailings, I always wonder like how much, can you just like pull from a book, or is enough buildings special? But then again, I also remember that there's a lot of not very special buildings out there. There's a lot of just functional, like boxes with windows.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, because you bring up a good point that is the issue too. Once you get to a certain complexity of buildings that are more custom, and therefore cost more money, then that's where things change. I don't know. I mean, I think it would be very rarely where it's a strict copy and paste, although, like you said, that actually could be used for 90% of the things built. But even if it would get you, 60 or 70% there, it's something to work with and then manipulate and customize on your own, instead of doing it from scratch. And my fear is that I feel like that's what a lot of small practices do. They create everything from scratch. And I'm like, I don't think you need to do that. Or you shouldn't have to do that.
Well, it's like websites.
You shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah.
It's like website creation. Like 20 years ago, everybody was just building their website from scratch
Sure.
and the landing page and finding out graphics. Now you just go to like Squarespace or any other platform, you select a basic template and you just fine tune it to make it your own, but you don't have to understand the script that goes behind
It's
building
sort of like
a website,
Inkscape,
right?
Yeah, and then of course, one side of it would say, well, yeah, but websites aren't, you lose some creativity. But then I'd say, well, on the flip side, if you go into the Wayback Machine, it wasn't like that creativity was yielding some sort of fantastic outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I always feel like that's the same thing with AI, right? I do fear the loss of creativity. And I feel like we were saying, we started this conversation, this idea of architects have a passion. And part of that passion is the craft of architecture. And so maybe that's why they have this compulsion to sort of roll their own, is that they love this aspect of doing it themselves and seeing their vision all the way down to those waterproofing details manifested physically at the end of a project. I mean, it is a very satisfying feeling.
That's true as
when
well.
The flashing goes in, that's it.
I love that flashing. Ooh, yes, flashing. I also appreciate that the last kind of broader point you made, though, of thinking about all these tools, whether they involve AI or not, as being tools to allow someone to be more creative, to get everyone to the next level, to buy them time, to be more efficient, rather than replacing creativity. I want to ask, kind of looking to the future, because in the span of the last 10 years, 20 years at most, the evolution of the quality of rendering and the speed and efficiency of it has, I don't know what that curve looks like on a graph, but it's very, very steep.
Oh, it's crazy.
And so, like, how soon are we going to be at a place where it'll be truly seamless, to where there's some kind of VR goggle headset, I suppose, and everything is just like all the conversation and work that we used to do in the past of constructing a rendering static or panorama or an augmented reality kind of experience, all that work to create it just eviscerates because of technology, and it'll just be there, and we'll probably just be talking to the computer and say, make that orange, and then it'll just do it.
Yeah,
like, I feel like it's going to happen soon.
It just sort of knows. There's a couple of components, it just knows, right? It's like, But then there's always this issue of, I always feel like, I see like these word choices or something like that, and like most people say like put in nail or something like that, and like you put in like some other word. I think what is a challenge though is I always worry about that loss of creativity ultimately, right? Once you trust the algorithm. And then you see this convergence of thought. And to me, that's very dangerous. So there's sort of a personal side where I worry about that future. I also worry about the fact that once you start to have that type of control, there's a lot of opportunity for it to be manipulated in such a way that you don't even realize. Like next thing you know, like there's a strong preference for a certain type of building material because that's just what's always there, and people that's what they build with. And it turns out that there was like some larger push to like, I don't know, the concrete cartel was making that happen behind the scenes or something. So I do worry about that. But that being said, just purely from a technical perspective, if we think about what we have now with Vantage, our Vantage software, it's real-time ray tracing. It's basically what you can do in V-Ray, but real time. That being said, though, there's a couple of things to note is that there's some artifacts that allow for it to be real time. Like, for instance, it won't necessarily support custom shaders and things like that, like those sort of like, the little file packets or programs that say really sophisticated users use to get just the right type of reflectivity off of a particular material. That might not be necessarily supported. So there's things like that where there's always going to be some assumptions and some deprecation of capability that you may not realize is happening, but it is for the sake of real time. Like, it's not just a matter of pure horsepower. It may be eventually, but right now it's a combination of sort of computational horsepower and some level of optimization on the code side.
Gotcha.
So there's sort of this two pieces together. Will we see the horsepower getting high up enough? I mean, you are to some degree, but it's always happening as a product of like I was saying, like someone's running, Enscape with a 220 line, a massive graphics card, right? Like that's not scalable.
Right,
So
right.
just because it's possible, right? Is it scalable or not? I suspect it will probably be a while. I think what you'll more likely going to see is a proliferation of really good capabilities as opposed to this astounding instantaneous capability in the near to intermediate. Like there's nothing on the 3-year horizon that's looking like that, right? That's like, I mean,
Sure.
what you're talking about would almost be like quantum computing or something like that. Um, the other thing, though, I think that we are noticing too is that when we use the term real time, particularly for certain things like, say, streaming, VR, real time, you start bumping up against other things that you don't really think about, which is like latency issues that are
Hmm.
actually pretty significant. And they end up being noticeable, particularly as you push more and more data. Um, I would think in some ways, they're all solvable in some ways. Like latency is, I've seen some programs that are solving it by almost predicting what's going to happen, and so they're serving that up.
Hmm.
Like yeah, you were on Monterey Car Week, right? Like you think of like the PDK transmission in a Porsche, it pre-spins up a gear before you shift. That's why it's so fast. So it knows what you're going to do and has the other gear going. So
Mhm.
then it just bangs and it goes. It's something like that where it's like I think you're going to start seeing more of that where kind of like it predicts what you want and then it delivers it and aligns it so it creates that perception
Mhm.
of that near instantaneous capability
Yeah.
without actually really doing it, right? It's doing it
Right.
because because we're so simple. So I think that's probably the more likely scenarios. You'll see something like that. I think from a computational perspective, yes, things are going that way, particularly on the CPU side. That's kind of the crazy part is we're seeing CPUs get so powerful now that I'd say almost like the bigger trend might be like a deprecation of GPUs,
Huh.
a rise of CPUs, and then a lowering of cost and an increase in accessibility, which I think would be great. GPUs are outrageous. I mean, it's like a whole nother computer and usually a really expensive computer that you're having to buy. But I think what you're talking about will happen, but it's not going to be today, tomorrow, next year, or the year after.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
Yeah. But check out our Vantage software, though. I mean, it's kind of what you're getting to in real time. Like it's like if you compare where coming back to your office, like after like a Monday morning in the server farms, like everyone had all the computers all linked up, rendering all weekend, with the signs of like do not touch rendering, versus like now you get real time ray tracing. Like that's boggling,
Yeah.
boggling.
That's it. So much time was wasted back in the day waiting for stuff.
Oh yeah, particularly like, and then it would like crash halfway through or
Yeah.
something, right? And you go like, oh, that's no
No.
good.
I think at that point in time too, well, this is another question that always comes up in my mind when we talk about these types of things, is there is a tendency for a lot of creatives and professionals to maybe care and focus on the capacity of something and what's possible rather than whether or not they should be spending the time doing that. So if going back to 15 years ago when the renderings would take as long as you're describing, my feeling was always like, is this worth it though for us to obsess over this one view that's going to spit out something that now when we look back was not even that good, not even that realistic at all? Like, was there other ways we could have been using our time to be, actually creative? And that's what I kind of like. I mean, that's what I like too when all the tools evolve to being much more, how did you describe it? Like a better paintbrush, so to speak.
Yeah.
It frees up. I mean, it's the amount of creative time wasted waiting for things to render or fussing over settings. In my view, was a waste of time. Was so massive, but now it's
Well,
it's
and
just taking the
we
burden
always
off.
talk about it, like I think it depends for each architect, but like some architects would rather focus on the design aspect of things rather than becoming a technician and learning perfectly how to use the software. Like they're kind of like, it's a tool, but there is a certain extent that you want to spend your time learning that tool before
Right.
you master the tool and not master your design skills.
Right.
I mean, it's important to remember, like, the rendering is sort of ephemeral in a sense, but the building's forever. So where should you put your effort?
Yeah,
Ultimately.
I think that's part of it too. I think that's part of the difference. I mean, you had mentioned before that folks in the media and something else professions.
Media entertainment, yeah, the
Right.
M&E, as we like to call it. Yeah.
M&E. I would assume that they in general prefer having full control in fine tuning all the dials.
Oh yeah, no, they want the 747 cockpit for sure. Yeah,
because their final product is that it comes through that. But for architects, that's not our final product. This is just to convince and convey. You know, our final thing is the building.
But they need a real-time solution too, though. That's the thing about, especially as you look at media entertainment right now, your virtual production. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's basically, you remember like Forrest Gump? It was like a green screen and that kind of thing. But now you have an LED screen.
Right.
And it looks right. And so now you're filming a person in front of an LED screen of like a desert scene or something like that. And you need to make sure that the sun's in the right place on a person's face and things like that, even though they're just behind an LED screen. And how does that actually look? How do you bring those two pieces together? And, they need a real-time solution. So that way they're filming something. They don't have to wait 2 weeks to figure out if it worked as a shot.
Right.
And so they need real time too, just in sort of a slightly different capacity. So I think there's an opportunity for real time for sure. And I think it's also worth noting that there's some firms that use real time that have won some major awards. Like Lake Flato is a big advocate of Enscape, and one of our favorite customers. Mm-hmm. And they've won the Firm of the Year award. The two founders just won the AIA Gold Medal. And it's like they just use Enscape. They don't use anything else.
Yeah.
And they're winning fantastic projects. They're producing incredible renders, and they're all using the real-time capability, and they're doing exactly like you were saying. It's like, hey, let's focus on the design. Let's not get overly belabored and twiddling knobs and dials to create a render. Let's do something that looks really good, communicates our idea, but let's let the buildings speak for themselves when they're done. Let's not make the renderings. That's not the objective here. The objective is the building.
And you guys actually have some pretty great video tutorials on your website to, anyone who has not used Enscape yet, if they're kind of like thinking of looking into it. You have some tutorials and even like packages of template project, I think, that you can download and kind of play around.
We try to pre-chew the food as much as possible, but there's even more than that, right? We have a forum that's pretty active. Employees monitor that regularly. Something that a lot of people don't know, some take advantage of, is you have applications engineers that you can actually set up some time with, and they'll hop on a call with you and actually like some of them, sometimes they'll even do training for offices virtually, just for things like that to get people up to speed. So one of the things that's wild to me is that we have people that use Enscape and they just kind of hit the render button and they're like, yeah, it looks good. And then you have other people who are really artists. And there's one you'll see occasionally on our Instagram feed and whatnot, who creates these like Tokyo, like cyberpunk night scenes in Enscape. And they're fantastic, right? And it's just like an incredible level of skill. In Enscape. It's like photoreal, futuristic, wild. And so you have this huge breadth of what people can get out of Enscape software. So yeah, easy to use, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily limited in what the visual outcome can be.
I mean, it just occurred to me, it must be interesting for you folks because you produce this tool and this product, and you obviously have expectations as to how it's going to be used. But once it goes out into the world, into the wild, so to speak, I'm sure there's a lot of use cases that you didn't necessarily think about before. And so I would guess, like constantly learn, like, oh, this is very amazing that someone would produce this image or produce this graphic or produce this whatever using our tool. And therefore, maybe we'll think about that as a new avenue or new feature or something.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to me, that's why I always... At Kieran Timberlake, I developed some software products as well, and those were distributed out there in the industry. And one of the benchmarks I always use for success is when people would take your tool and use it in ways that you never even conceived of. And when that happened, I'm like, okay, things are looking good. And absolutely, we see that with Enscape. Like by way of example, we were talking to a construction firm, and they were using Enscape in two ways that were really novel. One was like to figure out if they could fit equipment in during construction? Like, could they get like a lull, like one of those lifts in between two buildings? Could they actually get around a mechanical, like an HVAC unit on the roof in the mechanical penthouse? Could they actually get around it to service it? And they're using Enscape to find out if they could actually fit within that space with VR, which I thought was pretty fun. And then even more wild is that they were using it as part of their RFP responses. So let's say they had like a graph or something like that showing like construction schedules, some sort of like a Gantt chart or something, like a really snooze, boring chart. They would use Enscape to create like this immersive view so people could scan it with a QR code and like look at the graph. It's the same data. Nothing all that great, but they found that people would engage it a lot more. And so we actually started doing that in our trends report internally, or I would take the architecture billing index data, which, for most people in our firm, they're not that into it.
Sure.
And so we would look at people, like when they would read this report, I track, how much time they spend on every section, all that. And they weren't spending a whole lot of time on that data. So we tried what that firm was doing, and we saw an 800% increase in engagement in that data.
Who's that contractor? That's wild.
I know. That's what I thought. I was like, that's really cool. And they're big.
Amazing.
I mean, they're one of the ones you've heard of.
Yeah, I would imagine.
So definitely, there's ways that people are using our information and our capabilities in ways we hadn't thought of. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, like I said, that's sort of my perspective, like one of your benchmarks for success.
One last question for me. You did mention that your favorite architect was Eero Saarinen. Mm-hmm. So what is your favorite building from him?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of evolved over time. But when I was younger, when I was in college, I did a deep dive on the TWA Flight Center.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I just loved that building. I went into like all of the content that was produced at the time around that building and just like really got into it. Yeah, I mean, it's just a fantastic project. I mean, it's just so out there, right? Like, you're never building that again, which I really like about it. As I've gotten a little bit older, I think like the John Deere headquarters is really just like a delightfully reserved project, which I really appreciate. And then, of course, the previous U.S. Embassy is one too, where it has like this sort of this simplicity, but a beauty to it. Mm-hmm. It's also of its time in a way that I think that it's sort of irreplaceable. So those are some of the handful of ones. But the TWA Flight Center, it's like it's just one of those buildings.
Yeah. That red carpet, I mean, it's just...
Well, that's what's so fun about it, right?
Yeah.
It's like back then, like architects got to do the whole thing. It's kind of like when you go into you go to Dulles, right? And you had like the vehicles, like those tractors, you go back and forth to the plane and stuff. It's like things like that where it's like, man, this is just out there.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of architects at one point sort of having that pull. I don't think they do anymore, but maybe some do. But boy, that was just nuts. But then, on the flip side, there's also some really great new stuff. Like part of the means of sort of creating internal excitement is in those trends reports. I always feature a particular design project, and it might be like furniture awards, mm-hmm. Or it might be media entertainment, or it might be architecture. And so we looked at the Pritzker Prize winner. Was Chipperfield?
Yeah.
And we're looking at which ones we showcased. I think it was the America's Cut building in Valencia. And it's like, it's just beautiful. It's like just so simple, so clean, but just perfectly proportioned. I just love it. So there's a lot of those. Actually, I'm kind of curious for the two of you.
Did you favorite buildings is the question?
Yeah, or architects, and maybe the project of theirs.
I'm kind of boring. The ones that have always impressed me and continue to impress me are the ones that are no longer around. Louis Kahn's work has always stood out as being just from another dimension almost. And another dimension because it's formally, alien. It's just precise and complex and simple all at the same time, which is very, very weird and very, very difficult to do. And then almost very differently, I think Corbusier has always been someone I've admired because I view his work almost more like an artist. And I really appreciate not just the buildings, but I almost maybe even more so appreciate that approach to architecture. Like there's a freedom and a looseness to how he did things. And he had his manifesto and his 5 points, and he kind of just created his own language and was like, this is what I do. And this is valid because I've said these are the rules and I'm doing it. And this is what it looks like. And of course, there's a danger with thinking that way, but I think it can produce pretty amazing results that move the needle.
Well, without with that type of greatness, there's always going to be a level of danger.
True.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be boring too. Frank Lloyd Wright is probably my number one, just because when you look at, his career's work and the time frame in which it happened, I'm like, this guy was just a genius. He was just so many decades ahead of his time that it doesn't make any sense at all. So very fascinating, just a very fascinating architect. And then, of course, the more maybe European, I do love the Bauhaus movement, again, because it's kind of a combination of the different discipline, art and architecture, and they kind of creating their own language and systems that they implied into, buildings and art pieces, and were also very experimental, which is, if you're passionate about design, it's always kind of something that's attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Also nice selections. There's just so much great architecture out there, because I also think of some of my favorite buildings as opposed to architects, and I love brutalism.
Oh yeah.
Sure.
I just love it. And most people are like, oh, it's so cold. I'm like, I don't know. I sort of like it. There's nothing I like more. I mentioned earlier, UC San Diego for undergrad, and there the library is this building where it just feels imposing. And I get underneath it and and I just love buildings like that, where the sense of scale just dwarfs you. It's truly almost like a component of nature. Being asserted, but in a form that is terrifying in the sense that it shouldn't exist.
Right.
I just love that. There's something, and there's no other industry that can do that. Although I will say, actually, growing up near where I live, there was one of those satellite dishes they used to communicate with the various Apollo missions. I think it was called AT&T Earth Stations. And it was near a property that a friend of mine's family owned. And I remember being there as a little kid, and all of a sudden this giant satellite dish starts moving.
Yeah, that's weird.
And it was without a doubt, up to that point in my time, probably the most terrifying thing that I had ever experienced in my life. I was like, this should not be moving. It is too big.
Then it's going to start walking and then hovering.
No, seriously,
you don't know what's going to happen.
I wouldn't be here if that was the case.
And then the little green man came down the sky.
Roderick, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us. This was a fantastic conversation, covered a bunch of stuff. We learned a lot. I think our listeners are going to enjoy it and learn a lot as well. I'll put the links in the description, etc. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.